Well, no.
The other thing that we've talked about briefly before, Moores, but we're on the subject of fire, fire reflectors. What's your thoughts on this? And it seems to be a particular fad. You see it a lot on YouTube videos. As soon as somebody has a little fire, and then they've got a stack of wood, pinned between, a couple of uprights on the far side, and it's not even necessarily that cold.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on why people are doing that?
Well,
and what are are there any misconceptions there? And what's going on there?
Well, in the physics, only mirrors reflect. A mirror, a shiny surface, the surface of water at a certain angle, the surface of snow. So you get in the higher altitudes, you get reflection, which very often you get up a sunburn up your nostrils because there's reflecting out there. So to call a reflector, the phenomenon of reflecting, that's, Mylar blanket. Mm-hmm. It's got to be something very shiny. Mm-hmm. And even there are blankets that are not shiny, and they are almost useless because the aluminum appearance of the surface is a very poor. So reflection says, turn the direction of a glowing body back to you. Mm. And also, when you got a reflector, it's the inverse square law. Mm-hmm. It's actually the inverse cube law, because it was pointed out to me that the inverse square law works for a vacuum, and the air that surrounds you interferes with things, so it's a closer rule to call it the inverse cube law. So you're warming
air and it's convecting away, or it's just absorbing some of the heat.
The heating engineer that took this, he's actually a good friend of Randy's, and it was my good fortune that he took some courses, and he was involved in installing furnaces and all kinds of stuff, and I'm looking to the literature to try to describe fire, so that for every centimeter the back of the shelter is further than you need to be. You lose a tremendous amount of opportunity to heat. And if you don't build your fire right against the wall, whether it's made out of stone or logs, that's where you get the greatest effect. When you show a log wall a foot away to keep it like furniture so it's not consumed, that is a total waste of time, because the fire has to hit that surface, warm up, and then re-radiate all that way, and so on. So people who don't realize that they should go back to their physics that they took in high school, because what they're saying is not. It's kind of. I always sort of said, if possible, have science direct you. Mm-hmm. And that worked very well, and that's where the super shelter does so well, because you're playing around with the science of the warming rays, and it just happens, for example, that polyethylene is way more translucent to radiant, whereas glass is very opaque. So if you had a big fire outside of a greenhouse, you'd discover the glass would really prevent you from warming up the interior of that greenhouse.
And the glass itself gets quite hot.
Well, it could get quite hot.
But it's absorbing some of that heat.
Well, if you have a wood stove that has a glass door, and get a good fire going, and close the door, and get it going till it's woofing, and then put your hand, and you're almost touching the glass, and you can tolerate it. Yeah. Open the door, and now you discover that you gotta probably, you're gonna have to stay a foot further than you would have, because the glass was screening it. But now I get to talking, and the vibration of my brain, I start missing.
It was all relevant. But we were talking about the so-called fire reflector.
Yeah, well, there was in reality, it seems like in my line of work, I encounter unusual people that are more knowledgeable, because I would say if I went back to university and took physics and other things, So you mean, there's this guy, his name is Dr. Wally Cottle, a medical degree, comes from a long line of gunsmiths in Edmonton. And he pointed out, you say, in reality, there is no reflection. When you build a wall, it's absorption and re-emission. And that mechanism is so different that if you're thinking reflection, you're so far out that you are your own worst enemy. You're not doing it right. But if the idea is to warm the log, so the radiance that warms the log is absorbed by the log, and then the log gives off weaker, longer wavelength. So you might be able to utilize that in some way, but appreciate there's a big difference between a surface that is acting like a mirror, which redirects almost everything whatever hits it, whereas the log doesn't. So you're displaying your ignorance by so I'm trying to change the name. I said re-emitter fire. And I found a lot of trouble with that because I would say, oh, let's build a re-emitter fire. And the people would come along and say, what are you talking about, re-emitter fire? And I said, well, oh, you mean the reflector. Well, they don't want to change. No. I'm trying to, so the people that are coming up, that are not going to question that, but the old timers, oh, that's what you're at. And of course, they might not be that impressed or keen in that subtlety. So I would say wall backfire, and then I got around it. Okay. So build a wall. The wall could be dirt or bank or logs, green logs. And of course, if it's bitter cold, that wall back might be dry wood, because you almost need, at 60 below, you almost need the wall to work effectively. So you're trying to achieve a sort of like the infrared heaters that are trying to keep the ice from jamming the automatic doors, so they're shining down. You're trying to create a surface that glows like that. So if you work at it, you can actually do a fairly good job, which means that the biggest logs that you can find, and in extreme cold, they're dry logs, and as the fire burns against the surface, it acts almost like a catalytic heater, and the wall has to be high enough that as the fire burns, that wall causes a draw, and instead of the smoke going in your face, it goes over your head. And so
it's literally right next to the fire.
Again, that fire right. Anytime I see a person write a survival manual and they have a space between the logs and the fire, slam the book shut and don't buy it, because you're not going to get much benefit for someone who actually hasn't gone through the agony that I have to try to. The two things that are really poorly done, even yet, is fire in the boreal forest, long-term fire, sustaining fire. So if you can build a fire that you light it and then adjust it, well, most fires you're probably adjusting every hour. That means if you're trying to deal, you're going to have to get up and do something about it, because it'll be too cold for you to sleep. So the fire that burns a long, long time, that's an unusual fire. Well, in Finland, they will take 2 logs if they can get them that big, and they set them up so that the fire is in between. And that fire is not as robust as the big fire. You put it maybe this far away from the front of and since you've got a window, which no matter, it doesn't have to, in the open lean-to, the fire has to be about as long as you're tall. But in front of a super shelter, you can reduce it to half the length, and thereby get twice as much benefit for the amount of fuel you got left. And since you're using a super shelter, maybe use a quarter of the fuel.